Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you're doing well. At this time, do you have any questions about content you've been reading, about any aspects of the course at this time before we start new material this morning? Okay. All right, so folks, no surprises here. Okay, we're going to be staying on track with the syllabus. You know that next Thursday is your second lecture exam 2. And so please be advised that I will be sending out your study guide for exam 2 this afternoon. You will get that by the end of today, so you know what to expect and how to begin to prepare for your second lecture exam. Okay. So anything that's on your mind that you need to ask right now that might benefit everyone to hear an answer about? Okay. All right. Not seeing anything, so I'll assume that everybody's okay at this time. And so let's continue. We're in chapter 9 at this time, and we had, at the end of the last class, we had just finished talking about some of the anatomy of the eye. Okay, so I think to help you with that, we're going to continue a little bit more, and then I have a pretty nice video to show you to kind of tie it all together. Okay, so bear with me a moment, and we will get you to the note-taking screen. Okay. Okay, so the chat window is available, and the Microsoft Word document is open once again. Okay, so we're going to continue our conversation about vision, which we covered most of the relevant anatomy last time on page 154. Okay, so let's design a little flow chart that describes how light actually enters the anatomy of the eye and then is focused on the retina at the back of the eye. Okay, so let's see here. We're going to list this out as the path that light takes as it enters the eye. Okay, so no surprises here. Obviously, the very first thing is that you need to have a source of light. Okay, so I mean, you can think about the light bulbs hanging over your head in the room you're in, or obviously that giant thermonuclear ball in the sky that we call our sun, right, is generating tremendous amounts of light. Okay, so we have light rays from a bulb or the sun. Okay, these light rays pass through the cornea of the eye, so they enter and pass through the cornea of the eye. From the cornea, the light rays enter through the pupil of the iris, which we identified last time. Those light rays continue their journey through the lens of the eye. So number 4 is the lens. Okay. Number 5, the lens, of course, is going to help focus the light onto the proper location at the back of the eye, which is the retina. And most precisely, it's going to hit into the centralized pit that we defined last time called the fovea. Okay, so the light's going to hit the retina. Okay. Let me pause in our conversation at this point. Let me pause in our conversation and ask you a question in the chat window. Okay. The question is this: at what part of our pathway that's in our notes at this time, right? Number 1 is the light rays, 2 is cornea, 3 pupil of the iris, 4 lens, 5 retina. At which part of our pathway that we have diagrammed in your notes does the light information, does the light ray get converted into an electrical signal? Okay, there it is. Okay, thank you all for participating. Okay, that's good stuff. We need that, right? We need that, and it actually helps, it helps us be confident that we know the right answer, and it helps those that maybe sometimes get the wrong answer to correct their thinking, right? Okay, absolutely. Okay, the retina is the anatomy of the eye that is responsible for taking the information, if you will, that's in the light rays. If you've had a physics class, you know that light rays move as wavelengths of light. They kind of go up and down with different size, heights and lows, so to speak. Okay, so those wavelengths of light will be converted into electrical impulses, nerve impulses, action potentials in the cells that make up the retina. Okay, so very nice. That's exactly correct. Okay. Let's just put a little comment here. The retina is the location that light rays are converted into the electrical language of the nervous system. Okay, so I know that's a lot of words, but it's important to have this down in your notes. The retina is the location that light rays are converted into the electrical language of the nervous system. Okay. All right. So once we're at the retina, the electrical signals will be created. Okay. The cells, the rod cells and the cone cells that make up the fabric of the retina, they are going to depolarize. Remember that from chapter 7. They're going to depolarize. Sodium ions are going to enter, and that's going to generate that wave we talked about extensively in chapter 7. That wave is going to pass from those retinal cells into the optic nerve. So number 6 is the optic nerve. Okay. And from the optic nerve, obviously, that's going to conduct the information into the brain to be processed, or more correct terminology, to be integrated. Integrated means your brain is thinking about what the information means. Okay. So number 7, you're going to go to the occipital lobe of the brain. Okay. And you interpret. Okay. So in this area of the brain, interpretation of what you are seeing is achieved. Okay. All right. Nicely done, folks. Do you have any questions at this time? All right. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions. So what I want to do at this time is show you a little video here that actually covers a lot of what we said, but what it's going to do is bring it all together. So hopefully everything we've talked about, everything we put into your notes is going to start to congeal in your mind. It's going to start to make sense. Okay, so bear with me here. I'm going to show you a video. Here we go. Okay. All right. Okay, this is a National Geographic video, a little over 4 minutes long. So here we go, folks, and see if this helps you.
When you look at this painting, what do you see? A woman looking out a window? How about now? This famous painting by Salvador Dali is based on something called the Lincoln illusion. The effect shows how blurring pixelated images can make it easier to recognize faces. Optical illusions are fun to look at, but they can also tell us a lot about our sense of sight. So, how does the eye work exactly? And is it really true that seeing is believing? The human eye is pretty extraordinary. It has more than 2 million moving parts and can move faster than any other muscle at less than 1/100th of a second. But when it comes to your vision, the way you perceive the world is actually thanks to your brain. First, light enters the eye through the pupil. The muscles behind the iris squeeze and stretch the lens to focus the light onto the back of the eye. This is the retina. The retina is covered with sensitive photoreceptors called rods for dim light and cones for bright light. The focused light hits the retina at a small pit called the fovea, which has the highest density of cone receptors. We often compare our eyes to cameras, but they actually work quite differently. Our peripheral vision is very low resolution. We only see in full resolution at the small point of our fovea. But we barely notice it because our eyes are constantly refocusing on what we want to see, like a high-resolution spotlight. Pixels, or picture elements, are the tiny illuminated squares that make up a digital display. If 2 pixels are close to your eye, the retina sends 2 signals for the brain to interpret. Farther away, 2 pixels prompt 1 signal. That's why a TV screen can have a lower pixel density than a smartphone, but seen from farther away, it still appears seamless. When stimulated, the rods and cones send signals to the optic nerve and back to the brain. Then, all of that visual information is processed to create the picture you see of the world. Unlike a camera, your brain can actually fill in missing information. For example, your eyes automatically blink every 3 to 4 seconds. In fact, that means your eyes are technically closed for roughly 10% of your waking hours. Thankfully, your brain fills in those gaps, so you don't feel like the lights are flickering on and off all day long. There's a lot we still don't understand about the complexities of our visual system. As technologies continue to innovate, the line between illusion and reality could start to blur. And when it comes to how we see the world, there might be more than meets the eye.
Okay, gang. So a quick little video there from National Geographic. I thought it was pretty well done and you might enjoy it. So do you have any questions right now about eyesight, the anatomy, the physiology of vision, anything you'd like to ask at this time? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. So let's do one more little activity here that I think we can do in the virtual world as we are in right now with your eyes. Okay, so Quinn, I see your message. I will definitely send the video link in this afternoon's email if you want to watch it again, okay? All right. So, Pete, I see your question. Are we truly seeing everything? Yes, that's both a real question and a philosophic question, okay? We are seeing everything, but we're seeing everything in discrete pieces, right? We're not literally seeing everything continually. So our brain does a lot of processing. So sometimes we may not really be interpreting reality completely faithfully. Okay. All right. So, folks, if you have your video cameras, please turn them on. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Pete, Emily, Julia, Fiona, are you able to turn those things on? Paquasha? All right. So let me ask you, do you know what your dominant eye is? Do you know what your dominant eye is? For example, you probably know what your dominant hand is, right? Many of us use our dominant hand to write with. You know, I'm a left-handed guy, so that's my dominant hand. Okay, and you probably have you definitely have something similar, although some people can be ambidextrous. It's very common to have a dominant hand. So the comparable question becomes, do you know what your dominant eye is? Okay, so let's see if we can figure that out. And you're going to have to do something in the room and in the space that is around you. Okay, so I will try to stay within my video camera so you can see what I'm doing. But what I would like you to do is, in the space you are at, what I would like you to do is look at an object on the wall in front of you. Maybe it's a picture, maybe you have a plant, maybe it's a windowsill. Okay, look at an object that's in front of you somewhere. Okay, now what I want you to do is take one of your hands and take your index finger and place your index finger so that as you look out on that object, your index finger is in between your eyes and that object. So as you look at the object in the distance, as you focus on the object, you see this blurry finger in front of you. Okay? Is that making sense? Now, what I want you to do is keep that finger right where it is and continue to look at that object. I want you to take your other hand and cover up your left eye. Cover up your left eye and then uncover it. Let me ask you, when you covered up your left eye and uncovered it, did it look like the image was moving? It may or it may not. Try it with your right eye. Take your second hand and cover up your right eye. If your finger moves when you cover up the right eye and uncover it, if your finger moves, okay, so whichever eye, when you cover it up, makes the finger appear to move, that is your dominant eye. Okay, that's your dominant eye. Folks, are you seeing the effect that I'm trying to describe to you? Does it make sense? Okay, please type yes or no in the chat window if you observed an effect. Okay, great, great. Okay. Yes, Matt, absolutely, marksman training. Okay, very good. Okay, so folks, there are a few practical implications of knowing what your dominant eye is, and Matt correctly stated that, right? If you're involved in any kind of pistol shooting or rifle shooting, if you're going to be a marksman, it's very helpful to know which of your eyes is in fact the dominant eye. It can also be helpful in sports when you're hitting a baseball or hitting a golf ball when you get to the pro levels, to know which eye you really should be using to focus on. Okay, what does the dominant eye mean? Basically, it means that is the eye that your brain prefers to receive visual information from. Okay, that's all that means. Okay, but hopefully you were able to see that effect, and it's kind of a neat little activity you can do on your own at the house. Okay, do you have any questions at this time? Any questions about vision? Okay, let me reiterate to you, if you're not in the habit of getting a yearly eye exam, please do that. It really is very important that you have your eyes examined once a year, okay? All right, gang. If there's no questions, we're going to switch gears and we're going to go into the topic of hearing. Is it normal for your brain to make it look like you can see through your finger? Yes, Quinn, because you can look at different depths away from your face, right? You're able to focus at different depths away from your face. Think about it this way. Have you ever tried to focus a camera on an object and you got frustrated because you wanted the camera to focus on something far away and nearby at the same time, and it could not do that, right? You can only focus on one plane of reality at a distance away from your eyes, okay? Your brain will fill in the rest, which is why it can often make objects appear that they're translucent, that you're looking through them, okay? That is normal. Any other questions? Okay, great, gang. Let's go. Let's see what we can do with our hearing, okay? All right, here we go. Back to the Microsoft document, the Word document. Here we go. Okay. All right. Hearing. Okay. Folks, to make this conversation go just a little bit faster, because we really need to get into chapter 10 today, what I'm going to do is take you along a similar flow chart, a similar pathway, which we did above in your notes for light entering the eye, but we're going to do the same thing for sound waves entering the ear in an attempt to give you the basic overview of how your ears allow you to hear. And honestly, your ears are very, very important, but just like vision, the eyes were important, and then the brain did the interpretation. It's going to be the same thing for your hearing, right? The hearing provides the equipment to receive the sound waves, but ultimately your brain's going to interpret what in fact it is you're actually hearing. Okay? All right, so let's take a look. Probably the best page for visualization in your textbook at this time is going to be page 161, figure 913. Okay, figure 913. Okay, so let's describe the path of sound waves entering the ear. Okay, the path of sound waves entering the ear. Okay, obviously you have a source of sound that generates, meaning that creates sound waves. Right now, as you listen to my voice, my vocal cords are the source of the sound. And obviously, I'm speaking, the microphone attached to my computer is changing those sound waves into an electrical signal that then can be transmitted through the internet. And then your speaker at your house is recreating those sound waves so that your ears can hear what I'm saying, right? So there's a whole bunch of complicated things that make this work. But okay, number one, you have a source of the sound that creates the sound waves. Number two, those sound waves are going to enter your pinna, P-I-N-N-A. So take a look at figure 913 and you can see what the pinna is referring to. This is the part of your ear that you think of when you think of your ears, probably. It's the part of your ear where you would have your earlobes if you have hearing rings in your ears and things like this. Okay, so that's what the pinna is. The pinna is basically the cartilaginous portion of your ear that sits outside the bones of your skull. Okay, so number two is the pinna. Okay, so the sound waves enter the pinna. They then funnel into the external auditory canal. That's number 3. Okay. It's in the external auditory canal quite often, where you'll sometimes have to clear out your ears from earwax. Okay. And even though it may not be a pleasant thought, you know, every year people have to go to the emergency room because they have something stuck in their ear. And every year people have to go to the emergency room because occasionally, in a gross way, insects can actually crawl in that space and sometimes cause problems. Okay. So the external auditory canal is right there in the middle of page 161. Okay. Those sound waves will then funnel through the external auditory canal, and they will strike up against the surface of your eardrum, okay, which is sometimes also known as the tympanic membrane. Okay. All right. So the sound waves hit the eardrum, okay, which is a membrane. It's kind of a membrane. If any of you, well, you all know what a percussion instrument called a drum is, right? You listen to rock music or whatever music you like, and sometimes you hear the drums banging around, or you've watched a parade and a marching band goes past and you hear the drums, you know, with their crack, 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 crack. The drum has a membrane across the cylindrical structure of the drum. Okay, that's what an eardrum is like. It is a membrane. It's like a drum head. Okay, so when sound waves hit the eardrum, it makes the eardrum vibrate. It makes the eardrum vibrate. Okay, sound waves make the eardrum vibrate. Okay, you'll notice by looking carefully at page 161 that deeper into your ear, and as you look down on page 161, to the right of the eardrum, there's a space called the middle ear, and the middle ear has 3 tiny little bones in them. 3 tiny little bones in them. Okay, can you please type into the chat window what the name of these bones are? What are the names of the tiny little bones that we're going to put into your notes? Okay, malleus is one of them. Incus and stapes. Julia, nicely done. Thank you, folks. I know that you're looking at the right things. That's exactly correct. Okay, so deeper into the structure of the ear, to the right on the photograph, the picture on page 171, there are 3 little bones. Okay, all right, folks, which of those bones is physically tethered to the eardrum? Which of those bones is physically tethered to the eardrum? Pete, yes, these are the tiniest bones in your body. That's correct. Okay, nicely done. All right, folks. So when the eardrum vibrates, okay, when the eardrum vibrates, that's going to physically move the malleus. When the malleus moves, it's going to push up against the incus. And when the incus moves, it's going to push up against the stapes. Okay, so we'll put this all together as one comment here in our notes. So when the eardrum vibrates, 3 tiny bones called the malleus, incus, and stapes physically move. Okay, they physically move in response to the vibration of the eardrum. Okay, so it's important that you appreciate at this time that sound waves are creating a physical consequence in the ear. The sound waves are physically vibrating the eardrum, and the physical vibration of the eardrum is physically moving these tiny little bones. Okay, so you're taking sound waves and converting it into a mechanical motion of the structures in the ear. All right, so these tiny little bones move. Queen, can those bones break? Yes, they can. Any bone in the body can potentially break. Okay. Usually the bones in the middle ear would only break with extreme trauma or disease. Okay. Now, if you experience a really, really, really dangerously loud sound, like a firearm going right off next to your ear, very, very good likelihood you're going to rupture your eardrum. Okay. The eardrum may or may not heal. It depends on how bad the rupture was. And even if it does heal, a lot of times it is covered with scar tissue, so it does not vibrate as well. And you could become deaf. Yes, Pete. Okay. When those tiny little bones break, it's typically due to an inflammatory process in the inner ear that's creating so much pressure that the bones actually start to break. Okay, so can those bones heal? Potentially, but it's also potential that they may never heal. Okay, so there's a lot of things that are difficult to cover. But yes, all bones in the body can potentially break. Okay, any other questions before we continue? Okay, go ahead and keep asking the questions as we go along. All right, so these little bones move. Now, the next part I need you to pay attention to is, okay, which of those three tiny little bones looks like it's nestled into the oval window? Which of those tiny three little bones is nestled into the oval window? Okay, Catherine, thank you very much. That's exactly right. The stapes is nestled into this structure called the oval window. And the oval window is the opening of your major hearing apparatus called the cochlea. Okay, so number 6, as the stapes moves, it creates pressure waves in the fluid at the opening of the cochlea called the oval window. Okay, as the stapes moves, it creates pressure waves in the fluid at the opening of the cochlea called the oval window. Okay, so as we look down on page 161, put your eyeball on those things. Make sure you know where the stapes is. Make sure you know where the oval window is. Okay, make sure you know where the cochlea is. Okay, notice that the cartoon bubble in your book there on the bottom right says the cochlea converts pressure waves to neural messages that are sent to the brain for interpretation as sound. We can go a little bit deeper, a little bit more involved at that. If we turn the page to page 162, okay, here we have the cochlea and a specific section of the cochlea that's being highlighted called the spiral organ of Corti. It's the spiral organ of Corti that's capable of taking the pressure waves that were just generated by the movement of the stapes and generating these electrical signals along the auditory nerve that will then travel up to the brain. Okay, so let me highlight just a couple things here. Okay, so number 6 in your notes was, as the stapes moves, it creates pressure waves in the fluid at the opening of the cochlea called the oval window. Okay, so that's where we are right now with the anatomy of the ear. We're at the oval window. Okay, next, what I want to tell you is that inside the cochlea, as we get deeper into the anatomy of the cochlea, which is highlighted in figure 914, you're going to see a couple different membranes here. Okay, Somebody tell me what color in the textbook is your basilar membrane? What color is your basilar membrane? Basilar is B-A-S-I-L-A-R. Okay, Fiona, thank you very much. It's green, right? You have the basilar membrane, and you also have the tectorial membrane, which is kind of like a purplish blue color. Do you see that, folks? Both the basilar membrane and the tectorial membrane, okay? What I want you to be aware of is that in between these membranes, okay, if you look in between the tectorial membrane and the basilar membrane, you see these very specialized cells called hair fibers or hair cells, okay? These hair cells, okay, when there's a pressure wave created in the fluid of the cochlea, okay, Quinn, I understand you're having technical difficulties. Definitely try to review the recording today if you're having trouble. The hair cells, notice that the hair little fibers, they push up into the tectorial membrane, okay? Folks, there's a whole bunch of fluid in this cochlear space, and it's all getting sloshed around by the pressure waves being created by the movement of the stapes bones at the opening of the cochlea called the oval window. So you have these pressure waves that's creating a sort of vibration in the liquid of the inner ear, okay? Number 7, the vibrations, let's put it this way, the pressure waves create vibrations in the fluid of the cochlea. In part, those pressure waves are created because of these membranes that are constraining the motion of the liquid, which are the basilar and tectorial membranes. You get these vibrations in the fluid of the cochlea, okay? And as that fluid moves, it causes those hair cells, those little fibers coming off the top of the hair cells, it causes those hair fibers to actually move. And when these hair fibers move, they depolarize and generate an electrical signal, which is then sent along the auditory nerve up to your brain. So folks, please tell me from looking at your picture on page 162, what color is the auditory nerve? I see the questions. I'll ask the answer in just a moment. What color is the auditory nerve? Yellow. Thank you very much. Very good. Okay. So what I'm saying, folks, is that you get these pressure waves creating vibrations in the fluid of your inner ear. These hair fibers move around. They kind of like, kind of like a gentle breeze moving the blades of grass in your yard. They kind of move like that. But as they move like that, they depolarize. They depolarize and they create an electrical signal which is transmitted along the auditory nerve into the brain. Let me finish our notes here and we'll come back to questions. The pressure waves create vibrations in the fluid of the cochlea, which physically move the fibers on hair cells, which depolarizes them, creating an electrical signal that is transmitted along the auditory nerve into the brain. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, all right? Before I leave this topic, the motion of that stapes bone, okay, if you have ever been, okay, if you have ever been, how many of you have ever been to a water park, like Dorney Park, Wildwater Kingdom? How many of you have been to a water park? Okay, all right. So, I don't know if you've ever seen any video of what's behind the wall. So you go into the wave pool, right? You go into the wave pool and somehow these waves get generated and they push out, and you just enjoy yourself and have fun. But have you ever had a moment to look behind the wall to look at the machinery that's actually generating the wave? If you do, you're going to see these gigantic metal cylinders that are kind of going back and forth like this. They're sloshing the water like this, okay? They're creating the waves that you enjoy in the wave pool. Well, the motion of the stapes is kind of like that. It's moving back and forth as the eardrum vibrates to create a pressure wave that vibrates the fluid in the inner ear, which moves the hair cells, which depolarizes them to create an electrical signal that travels along the auditory nerve up into the brain. Okay. So Emily, you asked, how do cochlear implants work? Well, I'm not an electrical engineer, Emily, but I can tell you that the cochlear implants are basically an electronic replacement for the function of the biological cochlea in your skull. Okay, so typically what happens is there's different versions of cochlear implants, but typically what happens is these little electrical electrodes, if you will, are either attached to the bones that are moving, or they are attached sometimes actually to the back of the eardrum. And when the eardrum vibrates, those little electrical probes can then create an electrical signal that gets transmitted to the auditory nerve. So it's an entire electrical replacement of the biological cochlea. Okay. Can those hair cells get damaged or even fall off? Yes, Quinn, they can be damaged or fall off, and that's a common source of loss of hearing in folks as you get older. Absolutely. A lot of folks, let's be honest, you probably know from your parents and grandparents that sometimes they don't hear so well. And I don't mean that they're ignoring you. I mean that they literally do not hear as well. That's, that can definitely be caused to damage to the hair cells. The hair cells start to die as we get older. Okay. Folks, do you have other questions you'd like to ask about hearing? Okay. No. So obviously all this stuff is fairly complicated. Let's admit it. It's fairly complicated. And we take it for granted most of our lives until something's wrong. So what I'm going to do now is show you another video about hearing to try to help connect all these dots and make it a little bit more real for you than what I can do simply putting some words on a notepad for you, okay? So let's switch to the video, and hopefully this will help make sense of things for you. Here we go. Okay. This is The Science of Hearing. It's a TED Talk, a TED educational talk. It's about 5 minutes. Let's see what it has to tell us.
You hear the gentle lap of waves, the distant cawing of a seagull, but then an annoying whine interrupts the peace, getting closer and closer and closer until, whack, you dispatch the offending mosquito and calm is restored. How did you detect that noise from afar and target its maker with such precision? The ability to recognize sounds and identify their location is possible thanks to the auditory system. That's comprised of two main parts, the ear and the brain. The ear's task is to convert sound energy into neural signals. The brain's is to receive and process the information those signals contain. To understand how that works, we can follow a sound on its journey into the ear. The source of a sound creates vibrations that travel as waves of pressure through particles in air, liquids, or solids. But our inner ear, called the cochlea, is actually filled with saltwater-like fluids. So the first problem to solve is how to convert those sound waves wherever they're coming from, into waves in the fluid. The solution is the eardrum, or tympanic membrane, and the tiny bones of the middle ear. Those convert the large movements of the eardrum into pressure waves in the fluid of the cochlea. When sound enters the ear canal, it hits the eardrum and makes it vibrate like the head of a drum. The vibrating eardrum jerks a bone called the hammer, which hits the anvil and moves the third bone called the stapes. Its motion pushes the fluid within the long chambers of the cochlea. Once there, the sound vibrations have finally been converted into vibrations of a fluid, and they travel like a wave from one end of the cochlea to the other. A surface called the basilar membrane runs the length of the cochlea. It's lined with hair cells that have specialized components called stereocilia, which move with the vibrations of the cochlear fluid and the basilar membrane. This movement triggers a signal that travels through the hair cell into the auditory nerve, then onward to the brain, which interprets it as a specific sound. When a sound makes the basilar membrane vibrate, not every hair cell moves, only selected ones, depending on the frequency of the sound. This comes down to some fine engineering. At one end, the basilar membrane is stiff, vibrating only in response to short wavelength, high frequency sounds. The other is more flexible, vibrating only in the presence of longer wavelength, low frequency sounds. So the noises made by the seagull and mosquito vibrate different locations on the basilar membrane, like playing different keys on a piano. But that's not all that's going on. The brain still has another important task to fulfill, identifying where a sound is coming from. For that, it compares the sounds coming into the two ears to locate the source in space. A sound from directly in front of you will reach both your ears at the same time. You'll also hear it at the same intensity in each ear. However, a low frequency sound coming from one side will reach the near ear microseconds before the far one, and high frequency sounds will sound more intense to the near ear because they're blocked from the far ear by your head. These strands of information reach special parts of the brainstem that analyze time and intensity differences between your ears. They send the results of their analysis up to the auditory cortex. Now the brain has all the information it needs, the patterns of activity that tell us what the sound is, and information about where it is in space. Not everyone has normal hearing. Hearing loss is the third most common chronic disease in the world. Exposure to loud noises and some drugs can kill hair cells, preventing signals from traveling from the ear to the brain. Diseases like osteosclerosis freeze the tiny bones in the ear so they no longer vibrate. And with tinnitus, the brain does strange things to make us think there's a sound when there isn't one. But when it does work, our hearing is an incredible, elegant system. Our ears enclose a fine-tuned piece of biological machinery that converts the cacophony of vibrations in the air around us into precisely tuned electrical impulses that distinguish claps, taps, sighs, and flies. Dive deeper into the complex world of your senses with this playlist.
Okay, folks, so another video that I thought was pretty nicely done to give you an overview of the amazing abilities that you have in your body, okay? So, do you have any questions at this time that you'd like to ask? Because after this, we are going to transition into chapter 10. Emily, you should have been able to see the video, okay? Were you not able to see the video? Nobody could see the video. Oh, that's horrible. That's horrible. 1 second. Okay, I really apologize for that. I don't know why you couldn't see it. You should have been able to see it. Everything looks okay on my machine. So I apologize that you can't or you couldn't. So folks, I will definitely send you the video link so that you can watch it on your own time at the house, okay? That's horrible. Sorry about that. Okay. So life happens. Is there anything you'd like to ask about? Do you know anybody that has tinnitus, the so-called ringing in the ears? Okay. You have ringing in the ears, Matt? Okay. All right. Yeah, I mean, my mother has my mother and my uncle both have ringing in the ears, and coincidentally, they're both diabetic. In other words, there is definitely a connection between having diabetes and having not only hearing loss, but this thing called tinnitus, where you have this unusual ringing in the ears that's hard to get rid of. You know, I'm not an expert in the ears, but from talking to others that are more knowledgeable, even they do not know exactly what the problem is. There's something about the brain getting confused from the absence of sound, that the brain is creating an artificial signal, which is the ringing. Very difficult to deal with. Okay, Emily. I'm sorry to hear that, and I hope over time that will go away, okay? I think with Lyme, you're probably dealing with some inflammation in the ear, which is maybe causing some of that issue. Okay. All right. Any questions, gang, from anything we've talked about in Chapter 9? Pete, is it possible pills can impact hearing when younger? Yes. I mean, you know, absolutely, but that doesn't mean we understand how it's impacting things, okay? There are always unintended consequences of medications that we don't always know. So it is certainly possible, even if we can't tell you precisely what happened. Okay. Anything else? Okay, Pete. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. All right. Folks, if there's no other questions, let's begin Chapter 10. Okay. Okay, so. All right, so you should be seeing the Microsoft Word document again, and the chat window is up, so hopefully you can get a hold of me if there's any confusions or if you need me to repeat, okay? All right, gang, so that concludes our basic coverage of some major nervous system topics, right? You think about it. Chapter 7, we talked about the nerve impulse and went into some heavy things there. Chapter 8, we did a little bit of show and tell over brain anatomy. Chapter 9, we talked about some sensory systems, vision and hearing, which obviously detect stimuli, but then send information of an electrical nature into the central nervous system so it can be interpreted and processed correctly. So chapter 7, 8, and 9 really have a lot to do with the nervous system, okay? The nervous system is one of the major control structures of your body. I mean, it arguably is the major control structure of the body. But another control structure, which is also extremely relevant, extremely influential, extremely important, is the hormonal system or the endocrine system of chapter 10. Okay, so we're going to move into that area at this time. Page 171, 172. Okay. All right, chapter 10, the endocrine system. Okay. Right, so in the nervous system, right, in the nervous system, we said there was electrical communication, the nerve impulse, which happens along individual neuron cells. If we want a message to pass between cells, between one cell and another neuron, between one neuron and another neuron, or between a neuron and a muscle cell, we have to involve neurotransmitters, which is the second kind of biochemical communication. In the endocrine system, the hormones that are released are of a biochemical nature. They are not electrical, they are biochemical, okay? And what makes the endocrine system, you remember, is that the products that are secreted always get into the bloodstream, right? So you're transmitting information maybe from your heart down to your kidneys by sending a molecule in the bloodstream from the heart to the kidneys, okay? All right, so let's see here. So we'll start off with that statement to hopefully get you to remember that. Remember that the endocrine system is made of structures that manufacture and release hormones into the bloodstream, okay? And we'll put in parentheses that exocrine tissue manufactures and release substances, not necessarily hormones, substances that do not enter the bloodstream. Okay. All right, folks. So, a quick question for you here. All right, in your notes, quick question. Okay. Since we have just repeated what I think you already know and appreciate, which is to say that endocrine glands release hormones into the bloodstream, how is it, and if your bloodstream circulates through all your blood vessels, we haven't talked about that yet, that's coming along in the next couple chapters, but your blood moves through your blood vessels, and your blood vessels go from everywhere in the body to every otherwhere. In other words, you have blood vessels in the brain, you have blood vessels in your foot, right? And the blood moves back and forth between these locations, which means the hormones in the bloodstream have the potential to travel to basically every tissue and organ of the body. But my question is this: if the hormone that's in the bloodstream is basically being exposed to every kind of tissue in the body, why is it that only certain cells and tissues and organs respond to that hormone and others don't? Okay, so let's see how I can word that in your notes. What allows for hormonal specificity? And by that, I mean only certain target tissues and organs respond to the hormone, even though all tissues and organs are exposed to the hormone. What allows that to be true? Can you answer that for me? What allows for hormonal specificity? Only certain target tissues and organs respond to the hormone, even though all tissues and organs are exposed to the hormone. What can explain that? Okay, if you've had a chance to read this chapter, I'm hopeful that you can answer that. Okay, if you have insulin in the bloodstream, why is it that certain tissues respond to it and others don't respond to it? Pete, I think you might have it there. Just a spelling error. Emily, okay. All right, Emily, nicely done. So Pete and Emily have the basic idea, right? In other words, different tissues, different organs are made of cells. Thank you, Pete, that's correct. Have cells that have different receptors, which are made of protein, that can respond to certain hormones, bind to certain hormones. So if you have a cell with a receptor capable of binding the hormone, the cell's going to respond to the hormone. If you have a different cell that does not have that same receptor, it simply cannot attach to the hormone, and therefore it will not respond to the hormone. Okay, it's really that simple, but it's kind of amazing how this really works. Okay, so the answer to the question that I'm putting in your notes is only cells that contain a specific receptor capable of binding the hormone will actually respond to the hormone. You think about that as an analogy. Right now, you can appreciate that no matter where you are physically located at this moment in time, there are sound waves from a radio station that's broadcasting music in the room you are at, right? We know that's true because of our modern world. Somewhere there's a radio station transmitting sound waves carrying music, but you don't necessarily hear the music right now unless you have a machine capable of receiving the sound waves called a radio. Okay, so unless there are receptors on the surface of cells capable of binding the hormone, then the cell just doesn't respond to it. Okay, it's like the hormone doesn't even exist. Okay, do you have any questions at this time? Okay, so folks, you know, there's a lot in this chapter. On page 173 of your textbook, there is figure 10.2, and it gives you an overview of some of the major endocrine tissues of the body and the hormones that are released from them. You know, it's a little silly for me to say this because this is not what a normal class would be. We'd be together in a classroom. But my point is, don't try to memorize these hormones for two reasons. First off, because you're taking a virtual class, you're always going to have the book in front of you that you can look them up. But secondly, I'm not really interested in you memorizing a bunch of this content, but you will have to memorize a bunch of this content if you go to our more advanced anatomy and physiology course for nurses, okay? So definitely read over it, have a look over it, but don't try to commit it to memory unless you have a personal interest in something, okay? So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about all the hormones on page 173, although I will talk about some during this chapter. What I really want to talk about in this chapter is giving you a basic understanding of how hormones actually create a physiological response in the body. Okay, so to do that, I need to introduce you to two major classes of hormones, which your book does on page 172, and then also on page 174. Okay, so in your notes, okay, there are two primary categories of hormones in your body. Okay, they are the lipid-soluble hormones and the water-soluble hormones. Okay, so let's take the lipid-soluble first. Okay, lipid-soluble hormones would include basically what we think of as our steroid hormones. And remember, steroids are types of lipids, okay? So that's consistent with what you've learned from chapter 2. So this includes steroid hormones, like our sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen. Obviously, there's many others that we can talk about. Okay. The notable thing about the lipid hormones is that they they have a chemistry. The molecules that are the steroid hormones, their chemical makeup is such that they are chemically compatible with the plasma membrane of a typical cell in your body. And that's extremely important because the steroid hormones have a chemical compatibility with the phospholipids of the plasma membrane, meaning that the lipid-soluble hormones can actually travel from your bloodstream across the plasma membrane of a cell and enter the cytoplasm of the cell. Okay, so that's a unique feature of lipid-soluble hormones. Okay, so let's put that into your notes. Lipid-soluble hormones have a chemical makeup that is compatible with the chemistry of the plasma membrane of a typical cell. Okay, this allows the hormone to enter the cell. Okay, to enter the cell. In contrast, okay, in contrast with that, okay, so lipid-soluble hormones are highlighted for you on figure 10.3, page 174. Okay, page 174. In contrast with that, we also have the water-soluble hormones. Okay, water-soluble hormones are basically hormones that are made of amino acids or small chains of amino acids, which we call polypeptides, basically tiny proteins. Okay, so water-soluble hormones are made of amino acids or small proteins, which you know are chains of amino acids. Including, you know, the one that I typically give as a good example here is insulin, right? Insulin is a water-soluble hormone. It's a small chain of amino acids that are about 110 amino acids in length, okay? So water-soluble hormones are made of amino acids, including insulin. Now, what's important about this is that the water-soluble hormones are chemically incompatible with the phospholipids of the plasma membrane of a typical cell, which means the water-soluble hormones cannot enter the cell, okay? So they have a chemical makeup that is incompatible with the plasma membrane of a cell. So these hormones cannot enter the cell. Okay. All right. Any questions at this time? Okay. So what we need to do is spend some time talking about this content, folks. And what I want to do is go over a couple scenarios where we walk through the physiology of how these hormones would create a response from a cell in your body. But before we do that, I need to talk to you about a related idea that's really not talked about in your textbook at all. Okay, and so it's a concept called an acute and a chronic response. So let's talk quickly about acute and chronic responses of hormones. Okay, acute and chronic hormone effects on cells. Okay, and I'll preface this by saying that all hormones produce what are acute and chronic responses from a cell. Both both categories of hormones, lipid soluble and water soluble, they all create these acute and chronic responses that we're going to describe. All hormones, both lipid and water soluble, create acute and chronic responses from cells. Okay, so let me ask you in the chat window. Okay, I'm going to ask you a couple questions here and get you to participate. Okay, when you hear or read the word acute, what comes to mind? When you hear the word acute, what comes to mind? Small. Okay, Emily, thank you very much. Small could be relevant. Okay, Pete, so you think of a geometry interpretation, okay? Okay. Anything else? You think of very good hearing, Catherine. Okay, all right, fine. You're not wrong, you're just applying the word in a different context, right? Remember, everything is extremely contextual. So let me put it to you this way, okay? Another question coming through the chat window. If you had acute back pain, what would it be like? If you had acute back pain. So, okay, Bakwasha, difficult situation. If you had acute back pain, what would it be? It would be bad, it would be sharp, okay? Okay, a certain area, fair enough, okay. All right, well, to try to continue to tickle this out of you, okay, another question. How would acute back pain be different from chronic back pain? How would acute back pain be different from chronic back pain? Okay, Matt, okay. That's what I'm trying to get at this time. In the context we need to have this conversation, acute is temporary. So acute back pain is temporary, right? It may have come on last week and next week it goes away. But chronic back pain, you've had it for the past 5 years because you've had an injury of some kind and it just never goes away, right? So chronic means long lasting, if not permanent, and acute means temporary in the context that we're having right now. Okay, I understand that to some of you, acute might mean like a very sharp pain, but that's not what we really mean in this context. Okay, we're not implying a severity of the response or an intensity of the response. We're implying a certain of time-based dependent window of the response. Okay, so all right. So in your notes, consider the difference between acute back pain versus chronic back pain, okay? And what I'm trying to get you to see is acute is temporary. It might be incredibly intense, but it's still temporary. Acute implies a temporary or short-lived response, okay? Whereas chronic implies a long-lived or more permanent response. Okay, okay. Folks, are you okay with this idea of acute versus chronic? I'm talking about a response in a cell that is fairly momentary, perhaps only on the order of hours to days, whereas chronic could be long lasting, which could be weeks to months to even years, depending on the scenario that we're talking about. Any questions? Okay, all right. Seems like you're okay, so I will continue. All right. So let me throw an analogy at you. Okay. And so let me stop sharing my screen so we can see each other as we talk about this. Okay. All right. So let's use an analogy. Let's use a silly little story here to try to get some ideas across about this concept. Okay. Imagine for a second that you live in a small town, which might actually literally be true because here in South Central Pennsylvania, we do have some small towns, right? We even have some things that are villages that maybe have 200 people in. Let's say you live in a small town, and let's say that in your small town, you have a fire department that has a single fire truck. And so if you have a fire in your town, you have a fire truck that can go put out the fire. That makes sense, right? You have a fire truck, will put out the fire. Okay. But do you see that in your town, if you have two fires at the same time and you only have one fire truck in your fire department, you're going to be in a lot of trouble because that single fire truck can only fight one fire at a time, right? Okay. So let me ask you this, okay? In our analogy here, if we have the occasional random fire, then we have the necessary equipment, a single fire truck to take care of it. That would be similar to an acute response of a cell to a hormone, that the cell can respond to an occasional change from homeostasis, okay? But let's say in your small town, all of a sudden a group of devilish teenagers get the idea that they're going to set fires at 4 different locations simultaneously in your town. Obviously, 3 structures are going to burn down because you only have one fire truck. Now, let me ask you this, and I know this is a very artificial example, but stay with me here. What happens if these teenagers begin to set multiple fires in your town every day for the next 2 weeks? Are people in your town going to be very upset? Are they going to be upset? I hope they're upset. If people care about things, they will be upset, okay? So let me ask you this. If your town, thank you, Quinn, for your response. If your town has experienced a rash of unusual fires and your local police department cannot catch these teenagers, then isn't it true, as Quinn indicated in the chat window, that your town is going to have no choice but to somehow get some more fire trucks, to purchase some fire trucks, or maybe rent them from another community or something? Folks, when you have a town that has a single fire truck that can occasionally put out an acute fire that just happens randomly every time because life happens, and then all of a sudden the new normal in the town becomes multiple fires caused by these devilish teenagers, your town is going to have to adapt. It's going to have to adapt in order to handle this new normal of having multiple fires every day. And this is the point of the conversation, that the cells of your body can have acute responses to a hormone And then depending on circumstances that may change, it may have to adapt and develop chronic responses to the hormone. Or it's also possible that a cell is exhibiting a chronic response to a hormone, and based on changes we will describe to you, it will adapt and develop acute responses to the hormone. Okay, so if you have a single fire truck and you can put out an occasional fire, that's an acute response. Then all of a sudden you have multiple fires. Now we need multiple fire trucks to handle all these fires because nobody can catch these teenagers. That's happening all the time. So you're going to have to adapt to create a chronic response to get more fire trucks to handle these multiple fires. Okay? Are you with me, folks? Is this making sense right now? Okay, so stay with me here. Now let's take this idea we've been talking about and relate it to some biology. Okay? Let's say before next week's lecture exam that you get a little nervous. And in your nervous state, you decide to eat 6 packs of Twinkies. What's going to happen to your blood sugar when you eat 6 packs of Twinkies? Please type that into the chat window. What's going to happen to your blood sugar when you eat 6 packs of Twinkies? Okay, Emily, Matt, yes, it's going to spike, right? It's going to increase dramatically. Okay, folks, when you eat those 6 packs of Twinkies next week before your exam because you're nervous, your blood sugar is going to go through the roof. And the cells and tissues of your body are going to be like, whoa, what the hell just happened? But your body will do the best it can to respond to this fire with its fire truck, which is to say the pancreas is going to release insulin into the bloodstream to bring the blood sugar back down. That's like a single fire truck putting out the fire of having an elevated blood sugar level. Okay? Now, that would be an acute response. And to be honest with you, every day when you eat food, because we do eat food, our body is designed to handle momentary, temporary spikes in blood sugar, acute spikes in blood sugar, because we have to eat food to survive. Your body's designed to do that. But let's say next week, after you have finished your exam and you're resting at home on your couch thinking back about what happened during your day, you think about the fact that when you ate those 6 packs of Twinkies, you felt really energetic. You felt really good. And you start thinking to yourself, wow, I'd like to experience that every day. So you start eating 6 packs of Twinkies every day as your normal meal. Don't do that, by the way. This would be a really bad diet. But folks, if you start eating 6 packs of Twinkies every day because you like the sugar rush you got, that is similar to having multiple fires in your body, multiple fires in town. You don't have enough fire trucks to handle that emergency anymore. If you start eating 6 packs of Twinkies every day and having an abnormal spike in blood sugar every day, that is going to damage your body, because elevated blood sugar creates chronic body-wide inflammation in your tissues, which slowly over time will damage your tissue. It will damage nerve fibers, nerve endings, so that maybe the hair cells go, maybe hair cells die and you lose hearing, things like that. Okay, what I'm saying is, if you adopt this very unhealthy diet of eating 6 packs of Twinkies a day, and that's happening all the time, your cells have no choice but to either die or adapt. Now, obviously, your body's going to try to adapt because you don't want to die. So as you continue this really obnoxious new high sugar diet, the cells of your tissues have got to adapt. They've got to make a chronic adaptation to the stimulus, the sugar, so that you can handle this elevation. Okay? I know I'm still talking very philosophically and somewhat philosophically, but in just a moment, we're going to talk about how this really happens with cells. But am I getting it across to you somewhat of how eating a 6-pack of Twinkies once is not a terribly big deal? Your body can acutely respond to it. But if you eat 6 packs of Twinkies every day as your new normal diet, your body will have to adapt with a chronic response in order to avoid tissue damage. Folks, are you on board right now? Do you have questions here? Okay, all right. So now we're going to take these ideas, and I'll put a couple of things in your notes to trigger your memory while you're studying, and then we're going to diagram this out on a PowerPoint drawing because that's really the best way to look at this. Okay, so bear with me. We're going to go back to the Word document. Okay. Okay. So remember our story of adapting to fight multiple fires in a town, adapting from an acute fire emergency to a chronic fire emergency. Okay. Remember our story of adapting to an unusual high sugar diet, right? 6 packs of Twinkies. So adapting from an acute blood sugar spike on a single day to blood sugar spikes every day, okay, which would be chronic. Okay, so think about that. And now what I'm going to do is try my best to make these little stories make some biological sense to you in the next 20 to 30 minutes. Okay? Do you have any questions before we continue? Okay, so bear with me just a moment while I get the tech lined up here with PowerPoint to do this. Okay, so I'm going to shift to a PowerPoint. Okay, can you see the PowerPoint window on the screen? Okay, thank you, Matt. All right, good. Okay, so folks, we're going to do a case study, an example here of how insulin, which is a water-soluble hormone, is able to influence the activity and behavior of a typical cell, okay? And I don't think we'll get to it today, but I'll keep coming back to it next class. Now, I intend to hit the idea of diabetes fairly hard in this chapter because diabetes is such a common, devastating disease in our society. Okay, but so right now we're basically going to cover the normal healthy physiology of how insulin does what it's supposed to do. Okay, so you're going to want to make a drawing on your own notebook paper that you have in front of you. Okay, and so let me see here for a moment. Okay, what we're going to need is a really big cell. Okay. And so this is a case example, case study in insulin. Case study using insulin. Okay. So let me ask you at this time, question coming through the chat window. What are the two types of cells that predominantly respond to insulin in your body? Okay, it's a little bit of a loaded question because there are more than two types of cells that respond to insulin. There definitely are. But for our purposes here, you should certainly know the big two. There are two major types of cells, two major types of tissues, two major types of organs, if you will, that respond to insulin. Do you know what they are? If you have insulin dumped into your bloodstream by the pancreas, what kind of cells are going to predominantly respond to that insulin? Does anybody know the answer to that? What are the two types of cells that predominantly respond to insulin in your body? Okay. Okay, okay, Quinn, thank you for responding, and don't worry about sounding stupid. It doesn't matter, okay? There's no bad response here, okay? But blood cells are not correct, but thank you for trying. Anybody else? Okay, well, let me start with a different question then. Maybe we need to go back to some basics here. Okay. How does your body respond to insulin in the bloodstream? What does the presence of insulin do? Thank you, Pete. Right, type 2 diabetes is a relevant disease, but remember, right now we're not talking about disease. We're talking about normal, healthy body function. Okay. You know, in our 6-packs of Twinkie example, why did the body push insulin into the bloodstream? Okay. Okay, Matt, to respond to sugar levels. And okay, so Matt and Quinn, you gave me an answer that circled around the issue. Okay, so you're close. So you both say to respond or to deal with blood sugar levels. So what do you mean? The presence of insulin should increase blood sugar levels? Okay, so Peak glycogen is not relevant for our current conversation, but thanks for trying. Okay, Quinn, to decrease blood sugar. In other words, the presence of insulin should decrease blood sugar. That's what we want to happen because the blood sugar is too high because you just ate 6 packs of Twinkies. Okay? So I ask you again, what happens to that sugar in the bloodstream? Where does it go? When insulin's present in the bloodstream, how does the body decrease the sugar level? I mean, does the sugar just evaporate or is it relocated? What happens to it? Okay, Matt, that's a nice idea, but no, it really should not be expelled through urine, not predominantly. There are medications that can kind of make that happen, but that's fairly artificial. Quinn, you say turned into fat. Well, that can happen when you have disease happening, but that's not normal either. Okay, Quinn, you say it's turned into energy. What object in the cell would turn it into energy? Excuse me, I misstated that question. What object in the body would turn the sugar into energy? Okay, so what I'm fishing for, gang, what I'm trying to pull out of you, okay, is that the cells of your body are responsible for taking that glucose, that sugar, and converting it into energy. You learned about that, aerobic cell respiration. So I ask you my question again. How does your body respond to insulin in the bloodstream? Your body responds by doing something to glucose. What's it doing to glucose? I'm asking you, how does your body respond to insulin? When there's insulin present, what happens to the sugar? Matt, you say convert it to ATP. What's going to convert it, Matt? Well, okay. All right, folks, I appreciate you trying. I really do. You're telling me some good language, okay, but you are missing the point right now, okay? Folks, here it is in a nutshell. When insulin is released into the bloodstream, the body responds by relocating the glucose from the bloodstream into the cells of the body that can then break it down for ATP production. In other words, how does your body respond to insulin? It responds to insulin by having the glucose, the excess glucose in the bloodstream, be transported inside the cells of your body that can use it for ATP production. How does your body respond to insulin? It responds, when there's insulin present, it responds by changing the location of the glucose from the blood to the interior of the cells of your body. Okay? Insulin does not directly trigger aerobic cellular respiration. Insulin triggers the cells of your body to suck up the excess glucose out of your bloodstream. Okay? All right. So we're going to be putting that into your notes at a later time. So I won't bounce back to the note-taking window, but let me put it into the chat window. Insulin causes cells of your body to bring inside the excess sugar that is floating in your bloodstream. Okay? Insulin causes the cells of your body, it triggers them to bring inside the excess sugar that is floating in your bloodstream. Okay? All right. Does that make sense? So when you have heard throughout your life that insulin lowers blood sugar, well, how does it do that? It does it by telling the cells of your body to draw excess sugar into themselves. Okay, so insulin is causing a relocation of the sugar from the bloodstream to the interior of cells that can use it in some meaningful way. All right, so I ask you again, what are the two major types of cells that will relocate the sugar in response to insulin? Okay, all right, well, hopefully, if nothing else, you will have learned a little bit about diabetes and insulin regulation when you graduate from this course, okay? Folks, what I'm fishing for, thank you, Emily, for trying. That's not correct, but thank you very much for trying. I do appreciate it. Folks, the major tissues of the body that absorb the excess glucose from the bloodstream in response to insulin are your liver and your skeletal muscle tissue, okay? Liver cells and skeletal muscle cells predominantly absorb excess glucose from the bloodstream. Okay, well, when we talk about diabetes, I'll be sure that this stuff gets into your notes, okay? But so on our drawing here, the kind of cell that we have is either going to be a liver cell or a skeletal muscle cell, okay? And so I'll just say a liver cell this time. It doesn't matter. The same ideas are going to be true. Okay. So let's think about what's occurring here, okay? Insulin's going to be pushed into the bloodstream because you ate some food. You had, it's lunchtime, so maybe you have a cheeseburger or whatever it might be, okay? So that's going to cause the blood sugar level to rise. The pancreas will detect that. It will secrete more insulin into the bloodstream. So to simplify our case here, I'm going to represent insulin with the letter I inside a triangle, okay? So this is insulin. Okay. All right. Now, let me ask a couple questions. I know this is new stuff and maybe you haven't had a chance to fully read this chapter, and that's okay. But we need to be sure that you're staying with us here. Here's my question. Is it correct that insulin will enter the cytoplasm of this cell? Is it correct that insulin will enter the cytoplasm of this cell? Okay. All right, Matt says no. Do the rest of you agree with him? Okay. All right, so insulin will not enter this cell. Why not? Why is it true? Okay, Matt, very nicely done, right? Remember, insulin's water soluble. It's basically a chain of amino acids, and it does not have the right chemical makeup to pass through the phospholipid bilayer of the plasma membrane. So it cannot enter the cell. That will not happen. So what has to happen in the case of insulin, okay, which is our water soluble example here, what has to happen is that insulin will approach the surface of the plasma membrane of the cell, and because it's water soluble, it will not enter the cell. So the question becomes, well, how in the world can the cell respond to something when the entity, in this case insulin, cannot enter the cell? And the key is thinking about the surface of the cell. So at the surface of the cell, there is going to be a insulin receptor, okay? So I'm horrible at drawing, so I'm just going to put an IR here. IR for insulin receptor, okay? IR is insulin receptor. Okay. So let me ask some folks that are online here with me. Okay, hold on a sec. Okay. All right. So, all right. Fiona, do you have your textbook available that you can access it at this time?
Yes.
Okay, Fiona, on page 174, with our current insulin example that's being drawn on the computer screen, are we talking about the information of figure 10.3 or figure 10.4?
10.4.
Okay, thank you very much, Fiona. Fiona, just a couple more questions. Fiona, if we were to use the coloring of figure 10.4 in your textbook, what color would insulin be? What color would insulin be, Fiona?
Is it green?
It is not green, no. And that's, I'm sorry, please repeat. Folks, open question to everybody. What color is insulin using the coloring of your textbook? Okay, all right. So using the coloring of the picture of figure 10.4, insulin would in fact be blue. Okay, I want you to see how the drawing I'm making on the computer screen relates to the content of the chapter that you have to read. Okay, insulin's a water-soluble hormone. That means we're talking about figure 10.4. Okay, and in that case, the water-soluble hormone that they're describing is epinephrine, but in my case, I'm using insulin as an example, okay? But the color is blue. So figure 10.4, the hormone is blue. Second question, what color is the receptor in figure 10.4?
Green.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Now, Fiona, let me ask you, is it dark green or light green? Fiona, is the receptor dark green or light green?
Dark green. Sorry, I didn't know I was muted.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. That's all for now. Thanks so much. All right, so all I'm pointing out, folks, is that you need to be able to go back and forth between your notes and your textbook to see that you're getting multiple pieces of support here that you need to think about. Okay, and I'm not intentionally using the same color coding when I drew my drawings. All right. So insulin is going to approach and bind to the insulin receptor. So it's going to come up here and it's going to attach to the insulin receptor, okay? All right, now, as you see from figure 10.4, on the underbelly of the dark green receptor, there's this light green blob, which your book describes as an enzyme, okay? So, on the underbelly of the receptor, there's an enzyme here, okay? Okay, that enzyme actually has a precise name, and I'll give it to you. Okay, the enzyme has a kind of a fancy name. It's called adenylate cyclase. Okay, so that's ADENYLATE. That's the first word. The second word is CYCLASE, adenylate cyclase. That's the name of the enzyme. Okay, folks, that enzyme is going to take ATP and it's going to use that ATP to manufacture a new molecule, which in this case is cyclic AMP or CAMP for short. So this enzyme is going to take ATP and it is going to convert it to CAMP. Okay, CAMP, I'll type it into the chat window for you. CAMP is short for cyclic adenosine monophosphate. Okay. All right. So, all right, gang. So here's what we have to say. Cyclic AMP, in the language of the topic that we're talking about, in the context of our conversation that we're talking about right now, cyclic AMP is given a special descriptive name. Do any of you know what cyclic AMP would be referred to? Okay, so cyclic AMP, cyclic adenosine monophosphate, is literally the word, but it's also known as something else in the context of our current discussion. What is cyclic AMP? Do you know what cyclic AMP is? Let me give you a hint. The answer to my question, what is cyclic AMP? The answer to that question involves two words. The first word begins with the letter S. The second word begins with the letter M as in Mary. Do you know, folks? Not ATP, Pete, but thanks for trying. Remember, okay, there's going to be two words that answer my question. The first word starts with the letter S, and the second word starts with the letter M. Okay, Pete, that's great. Okay. You see, I'm not completely insane, am I? In other words, this really is in your textbook. Page 172. Page 172, the right-hand column of text. Go down to the middle there. Do you see a bold-faced phrase that says second messenger? That's exactly it. Folks, cyclic AMP is a second messenger. Okay. All right, so if cyclic AMP is the second messenger, what is the first messenger? If cyclic AMP is the second messenger, what the heck is the first messenger? Emily, the hormone, which in this specific example is insulin. That's exactly right, okay? So let's put that down in your drawing here, okay? I'll use orange. Okay, so insulin is the first messenger. Cyclic AMP is the second messenger. Okay, so let's think about what's happening here, folks, right? We're getting into the weeds. There's some new terminology that you need to get organized in your brain during study time. Okay, insulin's the first messenger. When insulin binds the insulin receptor, the shape of the insulin receptor changes, which then changes the shape of the attached enzyme on its underbelly. When the shape of the attached enzyme changes, it activates and turns on in such a way that ATP is converted into cyclic AMP. Okay, so insulin activates the receptor, which activates the enzyme, which leads to the production of cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is only manufactured because insulin bound to the insulin receptor. That's why cyclic AMP is the second messenger, because it was made in response to binding of the first messenger. Okay. Questions right now? Okay, let's see how you're doing here. Okay, so remember, you had a meal, blood sugar spiked, so insulin was released into the bloodstream. Insulin binds to an insulin receptor molecule, okay, which then activates production of cyclic AMP, the second messenger. Okay, so what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next is the following. Okay, so right now in the cytoplasm of this cell, I'm going to draw some molecules at random and just give them arbitrary designations like A and B and C and D. And I'm also going to put something out here, which is the GR for glucose receptor. Okay. Glucose receptor. Okay, so what's going to happen is this, folks. You know, every hormone is going to be a little bit different in the identity of the molecules that are responding to it. But the basic idea is that once you get the second messenger, cyclic AMP, manufactured, that is going to initiate a domino effect, a billiard ball response, where you have cyclic AMP go over and activate molecule A. Because molecule A has been activated, it's going to go over and activate molecule B. Because molecule B has been activated, it's going to go over and activate molecule C. Because molecule C has been activated, it's going to go over and activate molecule D. That's what I mean by the billiard ball or domino response. Okay. And the thing about it is, remember, all of this stuff is happening so that the cell can respond to the insulin by ultimately taking any excess glucose that's in the bloodstream Okay, so I'm going to put some dots up here that are purple, and I'm just going to call that a group of glucose. Okay. What will happen is this domino response will take place. The second messenger will activate A, which activates B, which activates C, which activates D. And ultimately, the glucose receptor gets activated. And by activated, I mean that when D interacts with it, it changes its shape and it opens itself up in such a way that you can now bring the glucose inside the cell. So this glucose is now going to be funneled into the interior of the cell. Okay. All right. Folks, do you have questions right now? Okay, Quinn, how quickly can this whole process happen? Very rapidly. We're talking seconds. Okay. And so your question is actually very well timed, because one thing I need to point out here is the following. Okay, everything you see here, well, let me, boy, after a while you start running out of colors here. Let me make it a yellow color. Okay, everything here that I'm outlining and circling with yellow, all of this biological machinery in the cell, from molecule A to molecule B to molecule C to molecule D to the glucose receptor, it is able to respond so rapidly to insulin because it was already present before the blood sugar spiked. Isn't that like having a town with a fire hall in it where there's already a fire truck pre-positioned? In other words, everything that you see in the yellow is actually part of the acute response. The acute response is possible and so rapid because the machinery of the cell needed to respond to the emergency already exists, and by and large does not have to be made in response to anything. The only thing getting made is a cyclic AMP, and that's a very trivial and rapid chemical reaction. Okay, so everything here is acute, and let me give a better color here. Okay, the acute response of the cell is rapid because molecules exist to handle the emergency, which is high blood sugar. Okay? Think about it this way. If you wanted to move to a new home, wouldn't you be able to move to a new home more rapidly if you purchase a home that has already been constructed than if you have to wait for the builder to build your new home so that you can move in, right? If you want to move into a new home, you can move quicker if the home has already been built than if you have to wait for it to be built. So the acute response is very rapid because the machinery to do the response has already been pre-manufactured by the cell. That's like having a fire truck already stationed in your fire hall, ready to handle the random occasional fire. Okay, questions? Okay, so if we follow the logical chain of events, let me describe it again, right? Because it's worth repeating things if you're having a hard time following. Insulin is placed into the bloodstream because your blood sugar went up because you ate some food. The insulin binds to the insulin receptor on the surface of a cell like a liver cell. That activates an enzyme which takes ATP and builds the second messenger cyclic AMP. That second messenger will then activate a domino response from molecules that are already present in the cell. They do not have to be made, they're already there, which leads to opening of the glucose receptor and bringing glucose into the interior of the cell, which achieves the ultimate goal of insulin, which is to lower blood sugar. You're lowering the blood sugar by taking the glucose in the bloodstream and transporting it into the cytoplasm of the liver cell. Questions at this time? Okay, I hope none of you are passed out yet, okay? So let's finish this, okay? Let's go back to our analogy that we started with. If you have an occasional fire in your town with one fire truck, you can handle that, and the cell's not, and the town's going to be fine. Nobody's going to be terribly upset because you have the necessary equipment to handle the occasional temporary emergency of an occasional fire. However, if we have multiple fires, then that single fire truck is going to get worn out racing from location to location to location, and it won't be able to handle the stress, and the fire truck's likely going to break down. In a similar fashion, if we continue to eat an unhealthy diet, 6 packs of Twinkies every day, and we have an obnoxiously high blood sugar level all the time, then the cells of your body, like the liver cells and the skeletal muscle cells, they cannot bring in the glucose fast enough to prevent inflammation. They cannot bring it in fast enough to prevent inflammation from taking place, which is what is dangerous with high blood sugar, is the inflammation that is triggered, okay? So if we have an unusual diet, then the cell has got to adapt in some meaningful way to get the blood sugar down more rapidly so that we don't trigger inflammation in the body, okay? And the way this is done is the following basic idea, okay? In your drawing, okay, I'm going to put the cell's nucleus, okay? So down here will be the nucleus of the cell. Okay, and you know from your study of chapter 3 that the nucleus of the cell is the location of your DNA, right? And the DNA is a double helix, so it kind of looks like that. Okay, so in the nucleus you have your DNA, which is where your genes are present, right? Your genes. Okay, you can read more about this on your own time. But your genes are sequences of DNA that tell the cell how to manufacture other molecules, particularly things like proteins. Okay, so what has to happen here is if you start eating an unhealthy diet and you have super elevated levels of blood sugar that are abnormal, your tissue is going to get biochemically stressed because the cells of the body cannot bring in the glucose fast enough. So what has to happen is we need to build more machinery. We need to acquire more fire trucks so that we can put out more fires more rapidly to avoid triggering inflammation in the body. And so what will happen is inside the cell, inside the nucleus, inside the DNA of your cell, you will have genes, okay, which are sections of the DNA. Okay, you will have genes that get turned on. You'll have genes that get turned on. And these genes will turn on and they will provide the instructions so that your cells can build, okay, they can build extra copies of molecule A. And they can build extra copies of molecule B, and extra copies of molecule C, and extra copies of molecule D, and as I think you can guess, extra copies of the glucose receptor. Okay? So, when you start eating a very unhealthy diet, your body will try to adapt to stay healthy and survive by turning gene expression on in the nucleus to manufacture new molecules that once those new molecules are manufactured would enable the cell to bring in glucose at 3 times the rate it could previously, right? If we originally started with one glucose receptor, that one glucose receptor has to do all the work. But if I now have 3 glucose receptors, now the workload is reduced by 1/3 for the original receptor, meaning that I can bring in 3 times the amount of sugar at the same rate as I could previously, which allows me to lower blood sugar more rapidly, which allows me to avoid triggering inflammation. Okay? The responses that have to take place in the nucleus, because the genes are being activated and new molecules have to be manufactured, which will then influence the behavior of that cell over many, many days to weeks to potentially years, depending on what we're talking about. This is your chronic response, gang. This is where the chronic adaptation takes place. Okay, the chronic response involves turning on genes to manufacture additional molecules to lower blood sugar faster. Okay? And as if you keep eating this unhealthy diet, the cell is going to continue to manufacture these molecules that it needs to ensure that it can bring the glucose in more rapidly. Okay? All right. Okay, folks, do you have questions right now about this? This is not a trivial process, and it will be the topic of an essay on your next exam. So you need to think this through. Okay? Is there anything you'd like to ask at this time? So if you understand what's happening here, you eat a normal diet, the acute machinery of the cell can handle the blood sugar spike, and everything's good. But if you eat an unhealthy diet with too much sugar all the time, you force the cells of the body to adapt by turning on a chronic response to make more molecules to bring the sugar in faster so we don't trigger inflammation. Now, let's say after eating an unhealthy diet for a year, a good friend of yours takes you aside and gives you a swift kick in the rear end and says, "What are you doing to yourself? You're eating junk food all the time." And so your friend is able to get through to you, and you decide to stop eating 6 packs of Twinkies every day and go back to eating a more healthy diet again. In such a case, the cells of the body that we just drew, they don't need all those extra glucose receptors anymore. So those molecules will be destroyed and recycled in the interior of the cell so that those building blocks can be used for something else that the cell does need, okay? So what I'm saying is you can go from an acute response to a chronic response back to an acute response, depending on your lifestyle choices. Do you have any questions right now? Other than why the hell did I sign up for this course? Okay. All right. Folks, let's take our break. And we do have lab this afternoon. Assuming that you were able to do most of the work that you should have done, it should not take us too long to review things, okay? So let's take our 15-minute break. Please be back online here at around 2:12. Matt, the test next week is Thursday from 7 a.m. to midnight, okay? Okay, folks, go take a small break. I'll see you in about 15 minutes.
One last thing, is there still class on that Thursday?
There is, Matt, yes.
Lecture's going to normal time, or is it going to be the hour delay?
I will probably do an hour delay again, and I'll announce that on Tuesday.
No problem. Thank you.